Welcome to CTO Insights, where we unpack the strategies behind high-performing engineering teams. I'm your host, Katerina, and today I have the pleasure of welcoming Tacho, CTO at DevEx. In this episode, we discuss the role of data and developer experience in enhancing team performance. Laura emphasizes the importance of balancing qualitative and quantitative data, the common pitfalls in using metrics, and how to get better insights from your team. We also explore the real impact of AI on developer workflows and how data can help leaders measure it effectively and set the right expectations. Stay tuned and don't forget to subscribe for more insights into creating high-performing teams and standout products. This episode is brought to you by Adiva, a global network of top developers connecting businesses with world-class talent. Whether you need to scale your team or bring an idea to life, Adiva empowers you to increase your engineering capacity without the overhead of traditional hiring. Visit adiva.it to learn more. Laura, welcome. Thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, nice to be here.
To kick things off, tell us a bit about the work that you do at DevEx.
Yeah, DevEx is a developer intelligence platform. So we help engineering leaders and engineering organizations get qualitative and quantitative data so that they can make better decisions about improving performance, reducing friction, reducing bottlenecks. We work with lots of companies across the industry like Etsy, Dropbox. And right now we have, of course, a big emphasis on measuring the impact of AI across engineering organizations. So it's quite an interesting place to work. So never 2 days that are the same.
When it comes to setting up infrastructure, especially for the first time, to measure developer productivity, it can be a very big investment for a company. In general, what are the benefits that teams can expect from setting up this infrastructure and starting to track and measure?
Yeah, I think having data to make better decisions is the benefit here. We often hear from developers what's not working, but being able to actually quantify how big the problem is and then track progress on remediating that problem is a huge benefit. I also think that it's important to mention that it doesn't have to be a huge investment and have to be something that's like highly technical to solve. There's a lot of work that we can do with self-reported data that's coming in through a survey, which is really fast to collect and also gives the right granularity of data. So we always want to think about matching up the granularity of data with what decision needs to be made. And so we could build out this really robust data infrastructure to get workflow data directly from our systems. And we might find out that this certain build takes 47.5 minutes. Or we can ask a developer, how long does this build take usually? And they might be able to tell you 45 minutes or an hour. And when we want that number to be 15 minutes, it doesn't really matter if it's 47.5 minutes or if it's an hour, like we know that something's wrong. And self-reported data is a really lightweight way to get a lot of useful data to help make better decisions almost immediately. I just want to call that out because I think that's often not a use case that a lot of engineering leaders think about when they think about survey data. We just think about like the feelings or sentiment part of it, but we can actually really use it to accelerate the quantitative data side as well.
Do companies typically start with self-reported data only and then iteratively add the quantitative side as well?
Yeah, that's a really common approach. And that is my recommendation very generally is to always start with a survey. For starters, it's much faster to get self-reported data on the quantitative side. There's also lots of data that we simply can't get from workflow systems like developer sentiment or asking, I can't look at a system and try to figure out how much time a developer lost because documentation was out of date. There's no system that can tell me that. Only a developer can tell me that. And so surveys cover everything. And then once you can validate that those data points and those measurements are useful, then we can work on building out the data infrastructure side of things, which can take a little bit longer.
Going further into the details of how you balance this quantitative and qualitative approach, can a team stick to using surveys only? Will that be productive, or are there certain things that are much more efficient pulled from a system, for example, and tell a better story?
Yeah, I think you nailed it right there with the efficiency piece of it because maintaining a survey can take up a lot of time. So first of all, we have the issue of authoring the questions so that they're reliable. And that is really difficult, much more difficult than people think it is. So if you have questions that are poorly authored, you're going to get wrong signal. So that's a risk. It's also really difficult to get participation for self-authored surveys. Most companies, if you're doing like a developer satisfaction survey or something, are seeing maybe like 40%, maybe 50% is really good. That's not great. You're missing an important chunk of the population. The surveys that we run at DX have a sustained participation rate of 90% and above, and a lot of our companies see 95% participation, which is just like really, first of all, a good signal that these surveys are meaningful and they produce meaningful change, but it's also a lot more reliable when we can cover the population with that response rate. The qualitative data, as I said before, there's a lot that you can ask. You can ask for self-reported quantitative metrics, like for the primary system that you work on, how many changes resulted in degraded service in production? What percentage of changes? That's a DORA metric of change failure rate. You could also ask on a scale of 1 to 10, how satisfied are you with this particular tool? Or how often do you lose time because you can't find documentation? Those are all kinds of things. But as you said, efficiency is a factor, and being able to pull that data in from a quantitative system is an efficiency and a time saver for sure.
So in an ideal case, what are some things that you would get from the systems, and what's the rest that you rely on from the developer surveys?
Yeah, I think in an ideal world, I would offload to the system data, anything coming from GitHub, from Jira. So thinking about like PR throughput, not because the survey responses aren't reliable, they actually are quite reliable, but just because it doesn't take time away from the developers to go through the process of answering the questions. We can automate that. It also helps once we have all the deployment data from GitHub, Jira Linear, whatever it could be, other tooling like Sneak or other security tooling, we can do some really interesting queries to see where there's correlations. And from the data analysis point of view, having a lot of access to the quantitative data can be a game changer for getting the right directional data to make better decisions.
Speaking of quantitative data, most of the friction in the industry toward metrics is due to misuse of that type of data pulled from various systems. And what are some mistakes that you've seen leaders make? And also, how do you balance that at DX? What would you suggest to people who use this type of metrics to consider the broader context?
Two big mistakes. The first one being that I think because we're like very logically brained in engineering, tend to see the workflow data as like correct or objective, and it almost never is. It takes a lot of effort actually to have like correct, complete quantitative data coming from workflows. So don't take that for granted. Like just because you're collecting it via scraping an API or direct integration doesn't always mean it's clean or complete, and that can lead you to some wrong conclusions. I think the other really big mistake when it comes to the fear, uncertainty, and doubt from developers is using this data for individual performance management, which is 100% an anti-pattern and something that I don't recommend. I think it's useful to bring data into the room in one-on-ones, and don't find yourself in a situation where you're looking at a developer and saying, oh, you didn't close enough pull requests last week and now you're on a PIP. That's not what these metrics are designed to do.
Regarding the qualitative data, so you have different types of surveys depending on the team, on the company, or what they're focused on, whether it's a platform team or working on direct features. Is there any dependency on that, how these questions are organized and what you get from them?
So our surveys are based on 14 drivers of developer experience, come from academic research that's been published in an academic journal. And we found that those drivers are pretty consistent, or they are consistent across all different groups of developers. So for example, mobile engineers have the same developer experience drivers as platform engineers. I think where things diverge a little bit is like the workflows and the tools. And so when we think about surveying developers, we have the main survey that's used across all of our customers, and that's really targeting like a application developer. Some companies have different workflows or limitations, for example, mobile engineers, and they have opted to have kind of some branching logic in their survey to give mobile engineers a subset of questions that are slightly different from the ones that application engineers get. Or data engineering could also be another example where things are sufficiently different to ask different questions, partly for the questions themselves, but like a lot for benchmarking. That was one of the kind of criticisms of DORA metrics. There's this deployment frequency metric, which is tracking how often you deploy to your customers in production. For mobile developers, this is really different because they have to deal with approvals in the App Store. And so being able to at least segment on different populations that have those kind of different workflows has been really useful for benchmarking and just making sure that we're accurately representing the complexity of the work that's getting done.
And at the end, that report, so there are certain indications that team performance should be improved. How does that typically look like? What are some common areas that you see room for improvement, and what are the action steps leaders can take from
I
that?
think broadly speaking, your developers know where things are broken because they're in the systems and they're using the tools every day and they know what's not working. I think what's difficult is trying to formalize that and get funding for it, or trying to make the business case for doing this project instead of something that, I don't know, maybe user facing a new feature. So that's where the surveys and the data can be really useful for decision making. What we see broadly is like all teams have friction points, regardless of whether you're at the most prestigious, like coolest engineering culture kind of company or at something that's considered a bit more like legacy or old school. All companies have bottlenecks. Build and test is definitely one. And we're seeing maybe a little uptick in build and test because now we have more code because AI lets us write more code. Getting a PR to green, getting the build to green is a friction point in a lot of workflows. So that's definitely one. Local development, local iteration speed, like being able to run tests locally, see the changes in the browser. Local development experience is another one. Documentation is another one. And I almost hesitate to mention it because it's so global and so universal. Everyone's trying to solve it. It's really tricky to get good documentation. So when it comes to figuring out what to do next, we do have a recommended kind of set of things you can do short term, midterm, long term that kind of accompany the recommendation. My more broad guidance, though, is like your developers know. And so this is all about listening to them, quantifying the problem, and they probably have ideas already of how to fix it. So we can do some more targeted studies to get more information and then just experiment with things, do a change, validate if it works or not, move on to the next.
Speaking of startups, so we mentioned like getting into analyzing, using metrics and tracking developer experience and everything. So the first step would be the survey. But then how would an early stage startup approach this? How can we go from, I don't know, a one-on-one call asking about common problems that developers face to a more thorough process? And when is the time to actually start working on a better process to do that?
I'm a firm believer that like starting early is the best time to start. If you have a small startup with 3 developers, like it's actually great because when you put these processes in place, they're just going to continue to grow and mature with the team. It's a lot easier to do it that way than being in a situation where you have 500 developers and then you're trying to put in some metrics and get people to use them. And that's maybe really the point that I want to make is the hardest part isn't collecting the data. The hardest part is getting people to use it. And so even a small startup can figure out what data is actually useful and then just start with whatever that might be. If you're trying to reduce pull request review time, for example, you might have a little dashboard that's showing your time to first review, time to first PR approval, deployment frequency, PR throughput, like some other things there. Start with those metrics, whether or not you want to use a vendor or collect them on your own. Like I've, in that situation, when I've worked at small startups, like we've just collected them and wrote our own little tool and had it populate a Google Sheet, and that worked until it didn't. And then it was time to come up with a different solution with a vendor. But there's a lot that you can do on your own, like a self-authored survey. I have some survey templates that people can use if they are at a loss for what to even put on it. And then combining that with just some reporting that's maybe already available in the tools and putting those together, getting people to use it. And then once you reach some level of maturity, then try to figure out what's next, whether it's a vendor or something else.
That sounds good. A common mistake that I usually see with startups, not only about tracking, but processes in general, is like trying to mature too fast. And then that slows the whole development process. It's a burden for the team. It actually happened with us as well, like focusing too much on defining a process for everything and being this mature company. So I think the balance there, like using a spreadsheet or using one-on-ones and writing down the data at the beginning with a three-people team or something, it's just the habit of getting into discussing these things with developers, as you said, helping them get used to using this as a tool
Mm-hmm.
for them to become better.
Yeah. The best solution isn't necessarily what like the big companies are doing. Solve for the problem that you have, not the problems you wish you had.
Yeah. Speaking of AI, as you mentioned it earlier, a lot of AI generated code. A lot of teams are claiming that they have AI independently contributing to certain things within their code base. How much of that is backed by real results?
It's so tricky because how do you define AI independently contributing? Does that mean that a line of code was authored by AI, in which case 90%? Sure. Does that mean that there's an agent independently opening and closing and pushing to production unverified by human changes? Like that, we don't really see very much. There's a site called SWE Bench, which is showing the different maturity and how models are able to actually complete tasks from start to finish with accuracy. And even the best models are only getting 60% accuracy or completion rate for a lot of things. So, while no doubt it does happen that teams are able to use agentic workflows, whether it's verified or unverified, successfully, I think broadly that's not really where the industry is right now. We're more focused on like code completion and co-authoring in an IDE, or even using chat modality to use for like brainstorming and architectural planning. I think that's probably the bulk of the use cases right now. And we're still just in the very, very early stages of agentic workflows being viable at companies.
Do you see discrepancy between the expectations of leadership and how AI actually contributes to developers?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And it's like not, I don't mean anything bad by that necessarily, but it's not hard. You open up any newspaper, LinkedIn, and there's like sensational claims of headlines insinuating that 30% of this company's code in production was written by AI, which is not at all really what's happening. In fact, I would say no company right now knows how much AI authored code is in production. The tooling just doesn't yet exist to do that. You can track, ask a developer, did you use AI to help author this PR? And yes or no. And if we're tracking that, then sure, AI is contributing, or 90% of code has been touched by AI if we track it that way. But there's just there's a lot of ad-based journalism out there where like we need clicks. And then also we have to look at who's telling the story. Is it a vendor who has something to sell you? Is it something else? I just approach those with a lot of skepticism and a lot of questions.
What would you suggest for for leaders to set more realistic expectations and also measure the impact that AI brings to the team?
I think there's two things. One is that data will beat hype. And so getting baseline measurements of how your organization is performing right now, and then checking on those measurements when you introduce AI and seeing how numbers move up or down, that is the best way to figure out how AI is actually having an impact for your organization, because this is an organizational problem. I think we can also look at then on top of that industry benchmarks. For example, we did a study of 38,880 developers trying to understand how much time they're actually saving from using AI, because it's not what's in the headlines right now. And the median amount of time that was saved was about 3 hours and 45 minutes a week. So that's like a 10%, roughly 10% time savings, which is really off from like the 30 or 50% that's sometimes being insinuated in the headline. So just staying grounded in the real data in your real organization is helpful. Looking toward vendor neutral studies. So DX puts out a lot of research. I'm working on lots of research right now, along with the rest of our research team. Looking for impartial vendor neutral types of reports like that will help you stay grounded, because the reality is a lot of what's out there is also marketing material for these tools. And I don't mean that in necessarily a bad way, but of course they're going to have the best spin, take the cherry pick data from the most favorable studies. And that's just doesn't often match up with what organizations see on the ground.
What are you seeing in practice in terms of developer experience and how AI helps improve it or not?
Yeah. So AI definitely does help improve it in a number of ways, like helping reduce the cognitive load, helping reduce the amount of time it takes you to get back into the flow after you've had an interruption, for example. Just using it as a brainstorming pair programmer is a use case that lots of developers find useful. Code generation, of course, is like the most obvious one. I think the one that we think about, AI is generating code for us, but also like stack trace analysis, for example, refactoring code, writing unit tests. These are all really good use cases for AI, ones that are having big impact on developers right now.
Do you have any final advice to share for engineering leaders listening today?
My biggest advice when trying to navigate this AI paradigm shift that we're in is that data will beat hype. And so I think engineering leaders are in kind of a tricky position right now because on one hand, we have more pressure from the business. It's almost like unprecedented that the business is asking us, why aren't we adopting this tool faster? Usually it's the other way around where we're trying to claw for a little bit of budget to improve CI/CD or something. And this time it's like, hey, I saw Microsoft is writing 30% of their code with AI. Why aren't we there yet? And that's just a tough spot to be in because we have to educate people about what's realistic. And that's a heavy lift. At the same time, developers just want tools that work. They don't want to feel that it's gimmicky. They just want to access the tools that work when they need them. And the hype also hurts them because it overpromises and underdelivers, and then it can feel alienating or, well, what was the big deal? This is all gimmicky. When in truth, like these tools do really help developers in a lot of positive ways. So yeah, just keep grounded in data, in your own organization's data, compare out, use benchmarks when appropriate, but understand that the headlines are headlines for a reason.
Thank you, Laura. It was great chatting with you about this. I hope that a lot of teams get a lot of insights from it.
Yeah, really glad to be here, Katerina. Thank you for inviting me.
CTO Insights is brought to you by Adiva. To learn more about how we support innovative tech teams, visit adiva.it. Don't forget to subscribe to CTO Insights on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Substack, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Thanks for tuning in.